So I'm going to read the opening chapter from this novel that just came out from Baen Books, Rhymer. And the first chapter of it is called On Huntley Bank. You understand? Ankou asked, and Thomas realized suddenly that his brother had been speaking to him. He looked up, mouth agape, lips slack as a drunkard's. He squinted. He pushed dirty fingers through his unkempt hair, shook his shaggy head. They weren't at home. His mother and father weren't here, his sister neither. What was Ankou saying? God, he's harmless! Baldy laughed. He stood behind Ankou halfway to the river. The river. Ankou shushed Baldy and tried again. You stay here now, Tommy. It's dry and you can sleep in the grass while we fish up river, right, little brother? He tenderly brushed back Thomas's hair. Thomas took in the tall reedy grass around him, the glimmering of the river ahead. Then he twisted around to see the trees behind him, black alders. He knew where he was, remembered they had come here from home, the route Ankou, Baldy, and he always took though the specifics of the journey itself eluded him. So many things eluded him. They'd been walking, but anyway, he wasn't allowed on a horse. He closed his eyes, saw his feet plodding along a path, following it from their big wooden hall with a keep upon its scarp, past sties and the well, across countryside past Oakmill and the Tweed, to the Yarrow where it met the Ettrick water, Ankou's fishing path. The weight of his brother's hand slid down and pressed upon his shoulder. Sit, Ankou gently ordered, and he opened his eyes again. Memory slipped away like a school of minnows. Thomas Lindsay Rhymer de Erseldun, half-witted 14-year-old son of a locally powerful family, did as he was bade and squatted down in the grass. He was lean and black-haired, and his fierce blue eyes could pin you sharp as blades, if you could get him to focus on you for longer than an instant. Had it not been for the fits that plagued him and the simpleness of his mind, he might have been a fine catch for most any girl in the town. The trouble was, everyone there and for miles around knew of his peculiarities. Some thought him possessed, others were certain he was touched, perhaps even divine. Weren't the Sibyls of ancient days similarly cursed, and the poet Taliesin as well? Opinions varied widely. Those closest to him, his father, even his mother privately, and definitely his brother, believed him to be a harmless idiot. His sister Innes alone thought him blessed by God in a way no one yet understood. Which wasn't to say that Ankou didn't love him, he did, but Thomas was more often than not a burden to him. Pushed down, he sat cross-legged among the reeds. He smiled to Ankou. "Hey-oh," Baldy said, "there's a relief." His thick mouth smirked beneath a nose bent crooked ever since the first time they had brought the idiot with them. That morning, Thomas had been seized by a fit, fallen face first into the Ettrick water, and would have drowned if Baldy hadn't waded in quick and grabbed hold of him. But Thomas, unaware of everything, including his savior, had flapped and windmilled and swung his head wildly back, cracking the bridge of Baldy's nose, getting himself dumped face down in the water again, until Ankou hauled him out. Baldy, cursing and spitting, refused thereafter to touch him for all the treasures of the Fae. When Ankou had flung him safely onto dry land, he rolled about and babbled, "The teeth of the sheep will lay the plow to rest," and then fallen quiet and still. As his predictions went, it made about as much sense as any. There were no fish caught that morning. Spluttering Thomas had scared them off. Since then, Baldy continued to give him a wide berth. If he'd set himself on fire now, Baldy would only have nodded in appreciation of the blaze from a respectful distance. "You don't follow us now," Ankou told Thomas. He knelt close, rubbed Thomas's back. "You stay here and sleep till the sun's down. Or I don't know, count the leaves on that black alder." Thomas tilted back his head and looked at the nearest tree upside down. 2,968, he said. "Leave him already," Baldy called. Boots off, he was wading into the water, hissing at every plashing step from one big precarious stone to another. "Christ, Joe. Then count the damn bulrushes." 87. "I could see more were I standing." He started to get up. "Well, you're not standing, Tom. Lie back down now. Count birds flying over, count clouds, count catkins till we come back and get you. And then tell me all of what you've seen, hey, sweet boy?" He did as he was told and stared into the sky, all but forgetting that Ankou was there. "Come on," insisted Baldy. "It's feckin' cold, and I'm not going to stand here till my balls crawl up inside me." Thomas heard Ankou laughing, tug off his boots, and wade out after his friend. Plump Baldy was generous, though he would never admit it. But Thomas saw him as true as the tenderness in Ankou's heart for himself. Heard them on the far bank then, Baldy chattering about the harvest. Their voices faded into the world where birds sang songs, no two alike, a conversation he could very nearly understand as he tracked it back and forth. And the reeds sizzled now, waving accompanied by breezes, and thoughts jittered and split and swarmed. Every moment took him off somewhere. He hardly noticed when the sounds and sensations of the whole world absorbed his brother and Baldy like soil soaking up rain. Time isolated him from before and after, cause and effect, sealed him off from human communication, from meaning. It could be sunrise one moment and night the next. Such discontinuity was just how the world was to Thomas. He was quite used to losing most of it. What was lost wasn't important, wasn't noticed. After a while, he tilted his head back again. 207 catkins, he said of a goat willow, larger than my fingers. He held up his hand to study those fingers. Dirt encrusted the broken nails. The sun was hanging low in the west now. Afternoon had arrived, new shadows, different lines, angles and slices out of the light. He placed his hand over the sun. The edges of his fingers glowed red-orange, and he smiled. A breeze blew, and reeds hissed all around him. An alien scent rode on the breeze. It drew his attention away from admiring his glowing fingers. He recalled every scent, every smell ever, though many had no name and simply came with images, moments cut out of a dark dough and scattered. This one was new, strangely sweet, like wildflower honey. At that moment the sun went into eclipse, or had it begun to set? His hand was just his hand again, held up against darkness. He lowered it. A strange shape sat upon a beast right beside him, silhouetted black against the sun. The shape seemed to have two heads. He squinted, but that didn't help. Odd spikes festooned the figure and the horse it rode, but he saw immediately that it wasn't a horse. It had a snout too long and too sharp, though it pawed the ground impatient as a horse. It carried its rider out of the sun's way, and brightness flared into his eyes again, making them tear up. The air tinkled musically, the sweetness enveloped him, and the bees making it buzzed within his brain, realigning his thoughts. Two tiny things like bats dove and flitted about the silhouette. Thomas sat up, wiped at his eyes, streaking dirt across his cheek, like some warrior picked preparing for battle. He was no longer staring into the sun. Peering down upon him was the most extraordinary woman he had ever seen. She wore a green cape, the hood fallen back to reveal her resplendent red hair beneath a pointed cap. The beast was revealed now to be a stallion of pure white, bedecked in a fine blue and gold caparison. How had he seen it differently? It also observed him coolly, but he hardly noticed that. The second head belonged to Ankou, who was seated behind the woman on the stallion. Ankou's expression was as dull as if he was asleep with his eyes open. Ankou changed his mind about fishing with Baldy, Thomas said aloud without noticing. Why? Something like invisible fingers seemed to prod and push at his head, creating a pressure not unlike what he felt just before a fit struck. But no storm raged through him. Instead, the bees buzzed about his thoughts again. Majesty, said a deep voice. Thomas followed it to a retinue of two men on their own horses behind her, knights in black armor. They had plainly crossed the river together. Shall we? No, Athelbrander, she said. Look at him. Poor broken toy, and such a pretty one, too. What a waste. I wonder, should we swap him for this other? Odd that her cherry lips didn't move as she spoke, though the words rang in his head clear as New Year's bells. The Queen of Heaven, he thought, but could not remember where he had heard the title. Was it a song? Wasn't someone playing a hurdy-gurdy? She smiled then with the magnanimous pity of a monarch, and in that smile lay her decision that would change her world and his in ways unimaginable. She would not take him in place of the other boy, but instead leaned down and brushed her long, slender hands across his face. Her blood-dark nails traced his forehead. His whirling, buzzing thoughts slowed, stilled. Desire plucked at him. For the first time in his life, Thomas experienced a silence inside himself. One thing was clear. Anku changed his mind about shh. The lady shushed him with the sound of the reeds, urged him to lie back in the grass again and sleep. To her retinue she said, "We will leave this one. Let him forget we passed. I've snatched his puzzle thoughts from him." He did lie back as commanded, but neither slept nor forgot. He could see in his mind the 59 silver bells woven into the stallion's mane and 12 stars along the reins, the way the shining barding across its forelock poked up as if the horse had horns, just as he could see the odd gold shape of the lady's eyes, which made him think of both buttons and spiders, the way her 6 pupils seemed like a circle of pinpricks within her bright irises. She pulsated with desire. He wanted to go with Anku. They went everywhere together. The bells tinkled as she rode off. The other 2 passed beside him, and like her, they each crossed the ball of the sun, and as they did, they changed. Spines as sharp and polished as thorns projected from their silhouettes. Their mouths became fanged, and the beasts upon which they were seated turned into things carved from dark skeletons, but not of horses. He had never seen anything like them and was too awed to be terrified. Close by came the Grey Rider's thoughts, matching the cold regard in their eyes. They wanted to kill him, nor cared that he saw their true nature. But their queen had been clear in command, and they passed him by, becoming men and horses again. He watched them upside down, riding toward the black alder, until the swishing tall grass hid them. He lay still a while longer, wondering about things, his thoughts assembling in ways new to him, in orderly patterns. The great roar of the world had quieted, letting him perceive his thoughts before he spoke them. Eventually he arrived at a troubling question that brought him to his feet. Why hadn't Baldy been with them too? By what new instinct he couldn't say, Thomas walked down to the strand of pebbles and small rocks where his brother and Baldy had crossed the river. The big stepping stones out in the water led to a path up the opposite bank. They always fished in the same spot across the peninsula of woodland. As he stood there, a long wooden pole swept past. Pulled along by the current, it clacked against the stones in the middle of the stream, rotated and slid between them. It was unmistakably Anku's dapping pole, tied with strips of leather at the handle and the juncture in the middle. Floating along the river as if in pursuit of it came a bundle of rags, but soon enough he identified a forearm, the back of a head, legs. The rags became a body. He waded in. It was icy cold, the water. He jumped from stone to intercept the body. It floated up beside him and he squatted, grabbed onto a sleeve and tugged. Baldy rolled over like a log. Face up, his blank eyes stared wide as if beholding something terrible in the sky. There was no wound, no blood to be seen. Sodden and heavy, he was too much for Thomas, and the current had its way, prying the body from his chilled fingers into the main channel and dragging Thomas in with it. He splashed, choked, hammered the surface with his arms, finally clutched onto the big stone again, and pulled himself back to safety. By the time he could look, Baldy was well down the river and a flowing clutch of rags again. Thomas managed to work from stone to stone and finally washed himself up on the pebbly strand, crawled out, and lay gasping. Pressure filled his head again. Streaks of lightning fractured his sight. He heard his voice as he always did, as if it was another's. A tyne for hell. They arrive, they take, all green with their enchantment. He mewled and rocked on the strand. Unlike every riddle he had ever babbled before, this one opened to him like a flower. His thoughts quieted, coalesced around it. The knights had killed Baldy to take Anku. But why? And where were they going? No war hereabouts, no fighting. No village, no habitation on that path in that direction either. Only the old abbey, and they were no monks. They arrive, they take. 50 bird calls trilled on the wind like tinkling bells. All greenwood. Thomas jumped to his feet and ran.
That was wonderful.
Thank you. So that's the first chapter, and you'll have to read on to find out what he's running to find out himself. What he will discover, who knows. I won't tell.
So that's a trilogy. Is this the first of the trilogy?
It's the first of 3, yes.
And do you already know when the others will be coming out?
Well, I just turned the second one in like 2 weeks ago. It's scheduled tentatively for next summer. So it'll be a year before book number 2 comes out, and then a year after that before book number 3 comes out, which will be due next summer. 4th of July due date.
Fireworks.
Such a holiday. Yeah.
Do you have it plotted out, the whole trilogy at first?
I don't, well, I mean, I have an idea of where everything is going, but I don't have it, I'm not much of a plotter, I'm a pantser kind of writer, so I know where the third one ends, but I don't know how I'm getting there, if that makes any sense. So each of these is in a different time frame as well. The character of Thomas becomes a sort of sempiternal champion, opposed to the elves, which is the Queen of Elfland, who's just ridden by. So I'm riffing on the Scottish ballad of Thomas the Rhymer. Later on in the book, I'm conflating that also with another Scottish ballad of Tam Lin. Part of the fun of research is finding out all sorts of things, and one of the things I found out in researching this book was that Thomas the Rhymer lived in and around a town called Erseldum, which is now called Earlston. That's a real place. And the story of Tam Lin, or the fairy tale, the ballad of Tam Lin, takes place in a region called Carterhaugh, and they're like maybe 10 miles from each other. So if you read them in sequence, it's almost like Tam Lin is the sequel to Thomas the Rhymer. Because Thomas the Rhymer is about him being picked up by the Queen of Elves and given a ride through hell and taken to, the land of the Fae and brought back again. Tam Lin is about a character, Tam, which is just another way of saying Tom. So it's sort of like Thomas Lin, and then you've got Thomas Lindsay Rhymer. So it's like the names are vaguely similar. Who is already turned into an elf, has already been transformed, and has fallen in love with a human woman named Janet. And that ballad's all about Janet basically saving him from being sacrificed as the tide that the Queen of Elves is going to use him for, and rescues him, and does so through an act of courage and such. But it almost seems like it's the same character in 2 different phases in the same story almost. So it was a lot of fun kind of weaving those 2 things together and turning into this kind of strange champion. And then the second book is about 100 years later, and he accidentally becomes Robin Hood. Kind of trips his way into the role. And the third book is set in Elizabethan England. And 300 years have gone by, the Black Death has gone by, and he's now living in London, and eventually ends up working for Sir Francis Walsingham as a spy, and kind of hooks up with Christopher Marlowe and the whole network of spies that were working for Queen Elizabeth at that period. So it's because the evil elves are part of the forces allied against her, and they're trying to assassinate her. So each of the books has a completely different story, but with the same character and moving through. And it started out as a collaboration I did with another writer named Jonathan Mayberry. And we wrote a story about the character of tea rhymer, as we called him at that point, in the 21st century. So I know how that goes way, way down the line, but we're not going to get there for a long time if this goes any further than 3 books.
Where was that published?
That was in a book called Dark Duets. It was an anthology of collaborative stories between 2 and, in one case, I think 3 writers. So all the stories were collaborative stories, and that was something Jonathan and I did. And then I had first drafted it because he was busy with one of his 8,000 other projects. And I did a lot of research into the background of it, and so we finished that story and kind of set it aside. But for me, it felt like I'm not done with this character. I've got too much information that didn't get used, so I'm going back in. So, I talked to him about it. I got an agreement that from him, that, yeah, go ahead and write it and go with it. So that's what I did.
Who do you work with at Baen? Who's your...
Just Tony Weiskopf is the person I've worked with so far at Baen. So.
I'm glad you came to Confluence. I'm really happy to have heard this. That was amazing.
Have you been to Scotland?
Yes, I have, a couple of times.
Yeah. Find any fairy? Did you look?
In a weird sort of way, yes. The first time I went to Scotland, I was on a bicycle, so I bicycled through Scotland, and that was an awful lot of fun.
Yeah.
Bicycling in Inverness, you discover very quickly that you can see Nessie everywhere. It's amazing. If there's any chop on the water, which is like every day, it looks like humps. But we went to a place, I can't remember the name of it now, we went to a place that was fairly famous or infamous, depending on your perspective, of a woman who claimed, a woman had started a, what do I want to say, a kind of commune. And she grew monstrously huge vegetables and fruits, or the commune, I should say, perhaps, grew monstrously huge vegetables and fruits because she went out and talked to the plant fairies, the fairies in the garden, and her produce grew enormously. It was really strange. But there was the photographic evidence. And look, she talks to the fairies, and look at the size of this melon. So it was just really strange. But it was an odd community. The people that were there, it was very cult-like as far as we could tell, because you had to give money to, basically had to give up all your worldly goods and everything and join this group, and that was where you live forever. And I just went, yeah, that's okay, thanks for going.
Nice place to visit, right?
Yeah, exactly, but we rode on by, so am I over time?
No, you're
Yeah. Anything else you want to share?
No, I think I've shared too much, actually.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you for asking.
I really appreciate it.
Thanks for recording, too.